My guest today is Lucy Zelić. She's a football journalist, a television presenter, and a strong advocate for women's sports. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you, Professor. Wonderful to be with you today.
Thank you. Well, why are you defending women's sports? Why is it necessary to be defending women's sports?
Well, it's extremely necessary, Professor, because women's sports are under attack. And it's not just women's sports, it's women's rights. And I think from my perspective, obviously being a football journalist and having sport run through my veins so readily for many, many years, it's something that speaks very closely to my heart. Of course, defending the rights of women and girls should be something that is fundamentally taken on board across the political spectrum and that has zero boundaries. But unfortunately now women are being told that, you know what, there are boundaries to your rights. And unfortunately, the rights of trans-identified males are taking precedence. So I think it's a very important cause to take up. And unfortunately, there aren't too many of us actually speaking out on these issues across Australia. I mean, if you look at what's occurring globally, you have global icons like Martina Navratilova, Sharon Davies, and a host of others that are coming forward to really advocate and rally on behalf of women who are suffering in silence over these issues for fear of cancellation and the loss of livelihood. But in Australia, we're kind of really struggling on the uptake here. And I think it's really important that we challenge that narrative that it's too controversial to talk about these issues, and that if you do, that you will be casted as a social pariah and potentially left without livelihood over it. I think the more people we have discussing these issues publicly, the more we're going to gain some momentum and the more that we're going to actually see ourselves reach a resolution in this space.
Well, what do you think of the rejection by the Court of Arbitration for Sport? It seems to be a pretty technical rejection of Leah Thomas's challenge to rules which prevent mature males who identify as females from competing in women's events. What do you think of that decision?
Well, I think it was the right decision. It was the commonsensical decision. And, I've as someone that's obviously studied sport business over the course of my career, I've acknowledged that the Court of Arbitration for Sport don't necessarily always get their decisions right. But in this instance, they certainly did. From a legal perspective, obviously, we have a host of challenges ahead of us, given that we have a range of, particularly here in Australia, a range of states and territories that are adopting self-sex ID laws, which is really starting to become problematic for women in these spaces who want to challenge trans-identified males, not just in sport, but in their change rooms, in healthcare and other areas as well. So the fact that they reached this determination, I think, was a really big win from CAS, that is, and that going forward, we can start to potentially see this shift in momentum from both a legislative perspective and also across broader spectrums of sport in terms of administration and the rulings and policies that they come to.
Well, I find it extraordinary that this should be happening. Christopher Ruffo, who's the author of the bestseller America's Cultural Revolution, said in a recent lecture at Hillsdale University's Washington campus that the transgender movement is pressing its agenda everywhere, using classrooms to propagandize and activist health professionals to promote the mutilation of children under the euphemistic banner of gender-affirming care. Where does transgenderism come from? Why is it so successful in the West, do you think?
Oh, look, that's the biggest question that I have in all of this. I wish I had the answer, Professor, because it's something that I have, from the minute I kind of started to really delve into this topic to even right up until now to speaking with you, I haven't yet been able to determine exactly why they have been, and this particular ideology and why this particular movement of transgenderism has been so successful in infiltrating a host of really authoritative branches across not just the Fourth Estate, but you've got it in medicine as well. I mean, you've got academics who are effectively arguing that, that males, trans-identified males that have gone through hormone therapy could be akin to what they like to call as cis women. I mean, the fact that you even have to call a woman a cis woman, I mean, it's not cis woman, it's just woman, by the way. But they've been able to infiltrate even education, science, and our politicians, our arms of government. I mean, it's been bewildering to me, the stronghold that they've had. But effectively, and looking at it in the case of Australia as well, well, when you start to have a look at, say, just from a sporting perspective, how they've been able to have such a stronghold on these organisations, it's through their partnership. So Football Australia, for example, right, they have the most participants at the grassroots level right across the country. So they have arguably the largest share and the greatest influence from a sporting perspective at the junior and grassroots level. Now, they last year made an announcement that they were partnering up with Pride in Sport, who, of course, we know is an affiliation and a branch of ACON, right? Now, ACON, we know many, many years ago, started off as being this organisation that was supporting those with HIV and AIDS, and now it's effectively mutated to become something else entirely. These organisations, Professor, and it sounds very cruel to say, but they're heavily reliant on the distress that young children are suffering at the moment with this concept of gender dysphoria. And they're heavily reliant on these children potentially seeking these forms of treatment that end up mutilating their bodies and putting them in a situation where they're having to regret these decisions if they consider going down that path when they choose to detransition. So it's really problematic. And I think the fact that we have politicians, for example, like here in New South Wales, Alex Greenwich, who's pushing through this equality bill. I mean, I've been a very, very staunch advocate for completely rubbishing this bill entirely because, you know, not only are we talking about attacks on religion here and the freedoms that they're entitled to and the, you know, religions that have been protected for thousands of years, but ultimately you're also looking at liberalised prostitution. Alex Greenwich is also advocating for children under the age of 16 to be able to access puberty blockers and medicalised treatments under this banner of gender affirming care. You know, it's disgraceful. And I think particularly in the wake of the CAS review, which has been a landmark study that's not only just come out of the UK, let's be clear about that. There have also been other studies in Europe that have determined that, you know, a lot of children experiencing gender distress, once they get to the ages of, say, 24, 25, that they look back and it was all just a phase for them. So, you know, we don't let children under the age of 18 smoke, drink or vote. And you can see now in the current climate, there's so many issues concerning vaping and how rapidly our politicians have run to put a stop to that and only be able to, you know, to give vapes to those at chemists who are over the ages of 18 and, you know, for their original purposes, which was to help people transition from smoking, right? They've run so quickly to move on those issues. But when it comes to children potentially making life-altering and regretful decisions concerning their bodies, they're putting their hands up and staying silent. It's really quite disgusting. And these politicians need to be held to account. I've seen that there have been a number of slight sort of movements from respective MPs across the country in both Western Australia and in Tasmania, saying that, say, for example, the West Australian Liberals, they've already said that if they are to come in to power that they would put a ban on puberty blockers. We've got MPs in Tasmania calling for reviews and rightfully so into gender affirming care. I remember this fantastic interview that I saw with Justin Coulson, who is also a child psychologist and talks very much so about parenting and the issues that parents are facing right now. And he had this fabulous interview in which he said, say, for example, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, but say, for example, if you get a severely underweight person with an eating disorder who comes into care, right, into a clinician's care and says, look, I feel extremely overweight and therefore I don't want to be eating anymore. You don't validate that person's mental status around that. You try to help them. You don't affirm the fact that this severely underweight person thinks that they're overweight. You try to correct these issues. And I think that's been the greatest concern with this transgender movement. Let me be clear and very clear in saying that, you know, transgender people who are experiencing these issues, they deserve the most responsible and most robust healthcare that's available. Can we honestly sit back here and will we be able to, in 10, 20, 30 years' time, be able to sit back and say, I felt comfortable with allowing a 16-year-old to take puberty blockers, to cut off their breasts and to mutilate their body, right? In the name of, oh, I've got gender dysphoria and this gender confusion. We won't be comfortable with that. I certainly, in the present tense, am not comfortable with that. I mean, I've got a daughter who's 5 years old who'll be starting school next year, and I think the fact that this type of ideology is being pushed in the education system as well is deeply concerning. And that's something that's a real worry for me, given that young women and girls are the most susceptible to this type of gender ideology. So I think we have to first and foremost question, what are the root causes? What are the root issues that we're dealing with when someone presents with gender dysphoria? And that's where we can start to really treat the issues, rather than, as the CAS review very scarily pointed out, rather than pointing people to, any types of gender affirming care or hormone therapy or surgery on appointment two. I mean, that's just madness. When I had the opportunity to catch up with a psychologist who works very heavily in this space, he's treated over 300 patients who have presented with gender dysphoria/gender distress. I remember asking him a question at an event where we met, and I said, of the 300 patients that you treat, how many of them have presented with other issues? He said, Lucy, every single one of them, whether it's child abuse, sexual violence, depression, autism, children presenting on the spectrum, they all had existing issues that needed to be treated. And in many cases, if they did go down the gender path of, having hormone therapy or mutilating their bodies or having any type of surgery, that it still didn't correct the issue. We're still seeing the American College of Pediatrics openly, very admitted recently, a few weeks ago, that these issues aren't prevented. Once they have these surgeries, these issues don't go away. It's not preventing suicide. So when you are hearing this information, why is it still acceptable that our politicians and people in key and instrumental positions across the healthcare sector are still sitting on their hands and not doing anything about it? That is the greatest scandal to me, and not the controversy, the so-called controversy of calling it out.
Well, the question really is, I suppose, fundamentally, to what extent is gender dysphoria induced by activists? There may be cases, I would have thought they were reasonably rare, of genuine gender dysphoria, but the growth in the number of children being involved in gender dysphoria suggests some inducement by activists who are pushing the issue and creating the problem in children's minds. As you rightly say, the psychologist told you that most of the children concerned with gender dysphoria were also there for other reasons. And this was yet another peg on which to attach their problems. It does seem to me to be very much an ideology which is being forced by activists, and the idea that the politicians and the departments of education should allow this to happen seems to me to be an appalling breach of the obligations of those who run the education system.
I couldn't agree more, but it's not even just the activists, Professor. You're also staring down the barrel of clinicians and people in positions of authority across the medical sector that are also pushing it and encouraging it. I mean, you only have to sift through the CAS review to identify that. And as I said before, one of the most terrifying findings, in addition to a host of others, many others, was that, clinicians were in several cases actually referring patients on appointment number 2 for surgery, right? And suggesting that they go on puberty blockers or, start taking hormone therapy. I mean, this isn't coming from just the activists who very much feel buoyed by their own position, as well as the politicians who are too afraid to speak out about it. It's coming from the medical industry. And that, for me, that has to be tantamount to medical malpractice. Doctors take an oath to do no harm. And for me, what we're seeing now is a rising cases across Europe where those who have been, through the process of either any type of gender affirming care and even gone as far to have had any type of surgery are now starting to sue these medical practices and these organisations who encourage that along the way, saying that, that they were only young, that they couldn't have possibly have consented to these types of treatments. So the fact that we're starting to see this shift there and that the tide is turning in that respect, I think is very important. But we need to see that shift start to occur here in Australia. And I think that we only have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 MPs that are advocating for this is slightly concerning, because one thing I've always maintained, particularly when it comes to issues of the rights of women and girls in sport and well beyond that, is that this is not a left or right or Greens or Teals issue. This is an issue that should basically cut through the entire political divide and have bipartisan support from everybody, because the rights of women and girls and young children are not up for debate. And the sooner our politicians recognise that, the sooner we'll start to see more positive change in these spaces.
Very well put, and may I thank you for your campaign. I think it's doing enormous good in our community, and long may you continue with it. Thank you,
Thank
Lucy.
you. Thank you so much, Professor Flint. I'm very grateful that we have men like yourself in this space who are asking the right questions and who are giving those of us who do have a voice and a very loud voice on these issues a platform to be able to share them. So thank you.
Thank you.